Good evening, friends, and warm welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and gently sail away to the stories of truly remarkable lives. Some noble, some tragic, all unforgettable. Tonight we journey to a nation divided, a young America torn apart by war, slavery, and the weight of its own unfulfilled promises. The year is 1861. The air is thick with anticipation and sorrow. The streets buzz with debate. And at the center of it all stands a man whose name would become synonymous with courage, wisdom, and sacrifice. Abraham Music Lincoln. Before we begin, a quick thought. If these quiet reflections on history's giants help you unwind, if they offer you a peaceful moment in your busy day, please consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps others discover these stories too. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Which leader would you like us to explore next? Let us know in the comments below. To speak Lincoln's name is to summon images of a towering figure, gaunt and severe, his face etched with the sorrow of war, his words ringing with profound moral clarity. But beneath the legend was a man of humble beginnings, a log cabin, a borrowed book, a mind sharpened by struggle. His story is one of relentless perseverance, of a self-taught lawyer who rose to steer a fractured nation toward its better angels. He was the ultimate self-made man, a true product of the American experiment. History remembers his triumphs: the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, the preservation of the Union. But tonight, we're not just here for the speeches or the victories. We're here to meet the man, the father who grieved lost sons, the leader who doubted yet endured, the weary soul who carried a country's hopes on his shoulders. We seek the quiet humanity beneath the harsh mask of statesmanship. And now, as the evening settles in, let's trace the life of a man who believed a house divided could not stand, yet dared to rebuild it. This is the bedtime biography of Abraham Lincoln. Our story unfolds in the Kentucky backcountry during the early, rather brisk months of 1809. Abraham Lincoln made his debut on February 12th. It was a moment that scarcely registered beyond the isolated settlement in which it occurred, but it marked the start of an era-defining life. His first earthly home was a simple log cabin nestled on a piece of land known as Sinking Spring Farm. You might picture this region as the American frontier in its raw youth, a sprawling canvas of ancient forests where settlers with considerable effort were etching out their lives. The challenge wasn't just building a home, it was conquering the vast, untamed wilderness itself. For these pioneers, existence was often a straightforward, unvarnished dialogue with necessity, a blend of stark challenges and an unshowy, quiet resolve. The nation itself, remember, was still young then, barely a few decades into its grand experiment. That cabin, young Abraham's first shelter, was a practical response to the demands of the era. Imagine a single room built from sturdy, rough-hewn logs gathered from the nearby woods. The floor beneath their feet was likely packed earth, a direct connection to the land itself. A stone fireplace would have been the cabin's warm heart, essential for both cooking the daily meals and chasing off the persistent chill. Light, a precious commodity, would have found its way in through a small window, perhaps covered with oiled paper rather than glass, offering a somewhat hazy view of the world outside. There was no excess, no ornamentation. It was in essence a dwelling built solely for endurance. Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, was a man well acquainted with physical labor and the unyielding nature of the frontier. A farmer by trade, he also turned his hand to carpentry when opportunities arose, always striving to provide for his family. As was common for many settlers pushing westward, Thomas relocated his family a few times during Abraham's earliest years. His quest was often for more fertile land, or perhaps a more secure legal hold on his property, a familiar narrative of hope and restless movement. Thomas knew the unglamorous, steady effort required to persuade the earth to yield a living. His focus was survival, not scholarship, a perspective that would later cause friction with his son. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, Abraham's mother, comes to us through historical accounts as a woman of gentle character and a quiet, thoughtful intelligence. Though her life was undoubtedly shaped by the era's hardships, descriptions hint at a reflective soul. It's widely believed Nancy possessed the valuable skill of literacy, a true distinction when formal education was a rarity. One can imagine her sharing stories or the rhythms of language with young Abraham, perhaps planting early seeds of his lifelong love for words. She represented a fragile link to intellectual life in an environment dominated by muscle and toil. Though her time with him was brief, her gentle influence is often noted as a key element in his formative years. For the infant Abraham, life within that Kentucky cabin was an elemental experience stripped to its core. You won't find tales of elaborate nurseries or an abundance of toys. His earliest world was woven from the fundamental sensations: the comforting warmth radiating from the hearth, the pervasive scent of wood's smoke clinging to the air, and the feel of simple homespun cloth. The daily soundtrack would have been the soft murmur of his parents' voices, mingling with the diverse, often untamed sounds of the wilderness that began just beyond their cabin door. In this Spartan existence, these few fundamental constants formed his earliest understanding of comfort and security. These were his first unfiltered lessons in what it meant to be. The immense wilderness that enveloped their small homestead was a powerful, if silent, instructor. Towering forests loomed nearby. Clear streams meandered through the landscape, and the presence of wildlife was an accepted part of daily existence. Growing up amidst such untamed nature would naturally hone a child's senses and their capacity for observation. The distinct procession of the seasons, the subtle tracks of animals, the practical uses of various plants, the telltale signs of an approaching storm. This was knowledge absorbed directly from the world itself, fostering a deep practical wisdom. The ability to read the natural world was arguably more critical than reading a book in this stage of American history. In the year 1809, the United States was still very much in the process of forging its national identity. For those inhabitants on its western fringes, like the Lincolns in Kentucky, the grand pronouncements and political machinations of the federal government in distant Washington could seem worlds away. Frontier communities were often characterized by their small size and a necessary self-reliance. Yet, this also fostered a strong sense of interdependence. Neighbors relied on one another for mutual assistance with major undertakings. Knowing that collective effort was often crucial for survival and modest advancement, news from a broader nation traveled at a ponderous pace, so the immediate concerns of local life usually held sway. The concerns of survival eclipsed the debates of governance. This then was the environment that cradled Abraham Lincoln's first years. It was undoubtedly a life of considerable material simplicity, defined by the relentless demands and unvarnished realities of a frontier existence. However, it is often in such challenging circumstances that certain strengths of character are deeply forged. Resilience in the face of adversity, a practical ingenuity born of necessity, and a profound understanding of the everyday struggles of ordinary folk. These foundational traits were the lasting inheritance of his earliest days. The uncomplaining fortitude of people building lives against a backdrop of hardship was a powerful example. These formative experiences would remain with him, profoundly shaping his worldview and his enduring empathy for the common person. The Lincoln family's time in Kentucky eventually drew to a close. Around 1816, when young Abraham was just 7 years old, Thomas Lincoln decided to move his family north. They crossed the wide Ohio River, venturing into the newer, even less settled territory of Indiana. Land titles in Kentucky had proven persistently troublesome for Thomas, a common frustration for many early settlers. He sought stability, a place where he could secure ownership and truly call the land his own. Indiana, then a raw and densely wooded frontier, seemed to offer a fresh start, a new chance to stake a claim and build a more secure future. This move marked another significant chapter in Abraham's formative years. Their new home was in Perry County, specifically in an area known as Little Pigeon Creek. Here, Thomas Lincoln once again set about the arduous task of carving a farm from the wilderness. This meant clearing thick forests, building another log cabin, and preparing the land for crops. Life in Indiana continued the themes of hard physical labor and close reliance on the natural environment that Abraham had known in Kentucky. The days were long, filled with the demands of felling trees, splitting rails, plowing, planting, and hunting. It was a constant, back-breaking negotiation with the ancient forest. Young Abraham, growing taller and stronger, was expected to contribute his share of the work alongside his father. The Indiana frontier was in many ways even more isolated than their Kentucky home had been. Neighbors were often few and far between. The forest was a constant, dominating presence, full of wildlife, both wondrous and dangerous. For young Abraham, these years were an immersion in the very essence of pioneer life. He learned the practical skills necessary for survival: how to handle an axe with increasing proficiency, how to navigate the woods, and how to understand the subtle signs of the natural world. He became intimately familiar with the rhythms and demands of the American wilderness. These were lessons not found in books, but etched into experience. However, this period in Indiana was also marked by profound tragedy. In 1818, when Abraham was only 9 years old, a terrible illness known as milk sickness swept through their small community. This disease, caused by consuming contaminated milk from cows that had eaten the poisonous white snakeroot plant, was a silent and terrifying frontier killer. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, Abraham's mother, contracted the disease, and after a short and painful illness, she passed away. This was a devastating blow to the young boy. The loss of his mother, who had been a source of gentleness and perhaps his earliest intellectual encouragement, left an indelible mark on his sensitive nature. The grief was immense, casting a long shadow over his childhood. The death was sudden and brutal, introducing him to the harsh, irreversible reality of human suffering. The death of Nancy created a harsh new reality for the Lincoln household. Thomas was left to care for 9-year-old Abraham and his older sister Sarah in an already challenging environment. The cabin must have felt emptier, the future more uncertain. Abraham took on additional responsibilities, and the weight of their loss undoubtedly matured him beyond his years. This period also saw him begin to turn more earnestly towards books, perhaps seeking solace or understanding in the written word during a time of such personal sorrow. About a year after Nancy's death, Thomas Lincoln traveled back to Kentucky. He returned with a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow whom he had known from his earlier years there. Sarah, or Sally, as she was often called, brought her own 3 children to the Lincoln cabin. Her arrival brought significant changes to the household. She was a kind, practical, an energetic woman who brought a renewed sense of order and warmth to their rustic home. The desolate, motherless cabin was suddenly filled with the energy of a blended family and the warmth of a nurturing presence. For Abraham, his new stepmother proved to be a true blessing. Sally Johnston recognized and encouraged young Abraham's burgeoning intellect and his powerful desire to learn. Unlike his father, who was largely indifferent to formal education, Sally saw the spark in her stepson. She ensured he had access to what few books could be found in their remote community. She fostered his habit of reading by the fireside late into the night, long after the day's demanding chores were done. She was a quiet but powerful champion of his mind. It was said that Abraham would borrow any book he could get his hands on, reading and rereading them until their contents were thoroughly absorbed. Works like The Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, and Weems's Life of Washington became his cherished companions. Formal schooling for Abraham was sporadic and very limited. Frontier Indiana offered few opportunities for structured education. Teachers were often itinerant, and schoolhouses were rudimentary, if they existed at all. Abraham himself later remarked that his total schooling did not amount to 1 year. The opportunities were meager, but his appetite for knowledge was boundless. Yet his hunger for knowledge was immense. He practiced his letters and arithmetic on any surface he could find. A wooden shovel, the back of a board, using charcoal as his pencil. His self-education became his true path to learning, a testament to his remarkable determination and intellectual curiosity amidst the privations of frontier life. This period of loss and learning in Indiana was crucial in shaping the resilient, thoughtful, and increasingly self-aware young man Abraham was becoming. As Abraham grew from a lanky boy into a remarkably tall and strong young man in Indiana, the world beyond Little Pigeon Creek began to beckon. The relentless farm labor had certainly built his physique. He was known for his skill with an axe and his surprising physical power. He could fell trees and split rails with a speed that earned him respect among the pioneers. Yet his mind, equally active, yearned for experiences and knowledge beyond the confines of their frontier homestead. The late 1820s saw him beginning to test the waters of independence, taking on jobs that offered glimpses of a wider society and different ways of life. One of his earliest significant ventures came when he was around 19 years old. He was hired by a local merchant named James Gentry to help take a flatboat loaded with produce down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. This was an arduous and sometimes dangerous journey of many hundreds of miles. For a young man who had known little beyond the woods of Indiana, this trip was a profound eye-opener. He would have encountered a bustling world of commerce, diverse cultures, and the unsettling reality of slavery as he witnessed it firsthand in the southern port city. This river journey was his first major exposure to the vast, complex, and morally conflicted nation he would one day lead. The journey itself, navigating the powerful currents and avoiding river hazards, demanded resourcefulness and courage. These early experiences on the river likely broadened Abraham's understanding of the country's geography and its varied peoples. It also provided him with a small taste of economic independence. Upon his return from New Orleans, the Lincoln family was preparing for another move, this time westward to Illinois, prompted by fresh concerns about land claims and perhaps the lure of richer prairie soil. In 1830, the Lincolns settled in Macon County, Illinois. Abraham, now 21, helped his father establish this new farm. He fulfilled his filial duty, helping to put up the new cabin and fence the land. But his own ambitions were beginning to point him in a different direction. Not long after the move to Illinois, Abraham decided to strike out on his own. His path led him in 1831 to the small, burgeoning village of New Salem situated on the Sangamon River. This marked a pivotal transition in his life. New Salem was a small but lively community, a collection of cabins, a mill, a store, and a tavern. It was a place where a young man with talent and ambition could make his mark. And Abraham, with his engaging personality and native intelligence, quickly did. In New Salem, Abraham took on a variety of jobs, showcasing his versatility and his willingness to work. He worked as a clerk in Denon Offutt's general store, where his honesty and good humor made him popular with customers. It was during this time that stories of his integrity, like walking miles to return a few cents to an overcharged customer, began to build his reputation as Honest Abe. He also worked as a postmaster, which gave him the opportunity to read newspapers from across the country, further expanding his awareness of political issues and current events. Later, he also tried his hand at being a partner in a general store, an enterprise that unfortunately failed, leaving him with debts that took him many years to repay. His business acumen proved less sharp than his intellect, but his commitment to paying his debts solidified his reputation. His physical prowess found an outlet, too. He famously wrestled a local champion, Jack Armstrong, to a draw, an event that further solidified his standing among the sometimes rough-and-tumble residents of New Salem. But it wasn't just his strength or his diligence that impressed people. Abraham possessed a remarkable gift for storytelling. He could captivate listeners with his humorous anecdotes, his thoughtful observations, and his clear way of explaining complex ideas. This ability to connect with people through language would become a hallmark of his later career. It was also in New Salem that Abraham first dipped his toe into the world of politics. Encouraged by local acquaintances who recognized his potential, he ran for a seat in the Illinois state legislature in 1832. Though he was defeated in this first attempt, he made a strong showing for a newcomer with little formal backing. Undeterred, he continued to cultivate his skills and knowledge. He undertook the study of grammar to improve his speaking and writing. Recognizing the need for a more stable profession, he also began to study law in his spare time, borrowing books and teaching himself the principles of jurisprudence. He also worked as a deputy surveyor for the county, a job that required precision and further familiarized him with the land and its people. These years in New Salem were immensely formative. Abraham was no longer just a farmhand. He was becoming a respected member of a community, a man known for his intellect, his character, and his burgeoning ambitions. He was learning about human nature, about commerce, about the workings of society, and about the art of public discourse. The rough-hewn frontier boy was steadily transforming into a self-made man, refined by self-study and public life. He was laying the groundwork for the extraordinary path that lay ahead, a path that would lead him far beyond the small village on the Sangamon. Life in New Salem during the 1830s was not solely about work and public ambition for young Abraham Lincoln. Like any young man, he experienced the stirrings of the heart, forming friendships, and, according to local lore and later accounts, experiencing romantic attachments that brought both joy and profound sorrow. These emotional chapters were as crucial to his development as his legal studies. These personal experiences, often tinged with a certain melancholy that seemed a part of his disposition, further shaped his character during these crucial years of self-discovery and early adulthood. One of the most enduring, though somewhat mythologized, stories from this period concerns Anne Rutledge. She was the daughter of the New Salem tavern keeper. Described as intelligent and comely, Abraham and were said to have developed a deep affection for each other, with some accounts suggesting they were engaged to be married. Tragically, Anne fell ill likely with typhoid fever, and died in the summer of 1835 at the young age of 22. Her death reportedly plunged Abraham into a period of intense grief, a deep depression that caused his friends to worry for his well-being. The loss struck at the very core of his sensitive nature, showcasing the depths of his capacity for sorrow. The precise nature and depth of Abraham's relationship with Anne Rutledge are subjects of some historical debate, as contemporary evidence is scarce, and many accounts were embellished years later. However, it seems clear that her loss affected him deeply, perhaps reinforcing a pre-existing tendency towards bouts of melancholy that would surface at various points throughout his life. This experience with such a personal tragedy likely deepened his empathy and his understanding of human suffering, qualities that would later resonate in his leadership. It was a painful tutorial in the fragility of life and happiness. A few years later, Abraham had another notable romantic involvement, this time with a young woman from Kentucky named Mary Owens. She was visiting her sister in New Salem. By some accounts, there was an understanding, perhaps even a half-hearted proposal from Abraham, but the relationship ultimately did not lead to marriage. His letters from this period reveal a certain awkwardness and uncertainty in matters of romance, a contrast to his growing confidence in public and professional spheres. He seemed to wrestle with his own feelings and his perceptions of what a partner might expect or deserve. He approached matters of the heart with a peculiar mix of honesty and hesitant introspection. Alongside these personal trials and developments, Abraham was making steady progress in his professional aspirations. His self-directed study of law was bearing fruit. He pored over borrowed law books, such as Blackstone's commentaries, often reading late into the night after a long day of other work. His determination was remarkable. He would reportedly walk miles to borrow a book, and his ability to absorb and understand complex legal principles largely on his own was a testament to his powerful intellect and unwavering focus. In 1836, he achieved a significant milestone. He passed the bar examination and received his license to practice law. This qualification marked a major turning point. Law was a respected profession, one that offered a path to greater influence and financial stability than his previous occupations. It also aligned perfectly with his skills in logic, argument, and communication. The law became the intellectual canvas upon which he could finally apply his self-taught wisdom. Shortly after becoming a lawyer in 1837, Abraham made the decision to leave New Salem. The village, though formative, was small and offered limited prospects for an ambitious young attorney. He chose to move to Springfield, which had recently been named the new state capital of Illinois, a place brimming with opportunity. In Springfield, Abraham initially partnered with John T. Stewart, an established lawyer and fellow Whig politician who had encouraged his legal studies. Later, he would form partnerships with Stephen T. Logan and then William H. Herndon. As a lawyer, Abraham quickly gained a reputation for his honesty, his thorough preparation, and his effectiveness in court. He handled a wide variety of cases from disputes over land and livestock to criminal defense. Much of his early practice involved riding the circuit, traveling by horseback with other lawyers and judges to various county seats when court was in session. This itinerant life was demanding, involving long journeys and stays in rustic taverns, but also kept him in close contact with ordinary people across a wide swath of Illinois. He became intimately familiar with the varied concerns, dialects, and humanity of the people he served. His courtroom style was often characterized by its clarity, its logical force, and its use of plain language and relatable analogies that juries could easily understand. He was known for his ability to concede minor points to his opponents, thereby building credibility before focusing with great effect on the core issues of his case. While he could be a formidable opponent, he also earned respect for his fairness and his efforts to mediate disputes and avoid unnecessary litigation whenever possible. The Prairie was shaping not just a man, but a distinct kind of lawyer, one whose character was as much a part of his practice as his legal knowledge. The move to Springfield in 1837 was a decisive and calculated step for Abraham Lincoln. Then a young man of 28, New Salem had been a crucial training ground, a place where he had found his footing and discovered his talents. But Springfield, as the newly designated state capital of Illinois, pulsed with a different kind of energy. It was a hub of political activity, legal practice, and elevated social ambition, offering a much larger stage for a man of his abilities and aspirations. Here, among a growing population of lawyers, politicians, and merchants, Abraham would truly begin to forge his career and public identity. Upon arriving in Springfield, one of Abraham's immediate needs was to establish his law practice. He was fortunate to be taken under the wing of John T. Stewart, a prominent lawyer and Whig politician. Stewart, who had previously encouraged Abraham's legal studies, offered him a partnership. This provided the newcomer with an immediate entry into the Springfield legal community. Their office quickly became a busy place, handling a diverse array of cases that reflected the concerns of a developing society: land disputes, debt collections, criminal matters, and more. Abraham's reputation as a highly capable and honest attorney began to grow. Springfield in the late 1830s and 1840s was a lively, if somewhat rustic, frontier capital. Its streets were often muddy, and its amenities were still developing. But it was a place where important connections were made and political fortunes were shaped. The sessions of the state legislature brought lawmakers, lobbyists, and citizens with various interests to the town, creating a vibrant atmosphere of debate and maneuvering. Abraham, already having served a term in the legislature representing Sangamon County, elected while still in New Salem, was a known figure in these circles. He was re-elected several times, becoming a key member of the Long Nine, a group of Whig legislators from Sangamon County known for their tall stature and their successful efforts to have Springfield chosen as the capital. His service in the Illinois legislature was a significant part of his political education. He was deeply involved in debates over internal improvements, such as the development of roads, canals, and railroads, which were seen as crucial for the state's economic progress. He also took positions on banking issues and other matters of public policy. He learned the arts of negotiation, compromise, and legislative strategy. While not yet the polished orator he would become, his clear reasoning and earnest sincerity were already making an impression. It was also in Springfield that Abraham's social life took a new turn. He was introduced to a different circle of society than he had known in New Salem. Among the notable figures he encountered was Mary Todd, a well-educated and spirited young woman from a prominent Lexington, Kentucky, slaveholding family. Mary was visiting her sister, who was married to Ninian Edwards, a son of a former Illinois governor. Mary was vivacious, intelligent, and politically astute, but also known for her sometimes volatile temperament. The courtship of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd was a complex affair marked by periods of intensity, doubt, and even a temporary breaking off of their engagement. Abraham himself seemed to wrestle with anxieties about his suitability as a husband for a woman of Mary's background and social standing. He was keenly aware of his own humble origins and his ongoing struggles with debt from his New Salem store. Despite these hesitations and the concerns of some of Mary's relatives about Abraham's rougher edges, the two were eventually married in November 1842. Their marriage would be a long and complex one, bringing both profound partnership and deep personal sorrows. Mary's belief in Abraham's potential was unwavering, and she played an important role in encouraging his ambitions. However, their differing temperaments and the later tragedies they would endure, including the loss of 3 of their 4 sons, would place immense strain on their relationship. In these early Springfield years, though, they established a home and started a family, with their first son, Robert Todd Lincoln, being born in 1843. Professionally, Abraham continued to rise. After his partnership with Stewart, he joined forces with Stephen T. Logan, considered one of the finest legal minds in Illinois. This partnership further honed Abraham's legal skills, particularly in meticulous case preparation and precise legal reasoning. Later, he would establish his longest-lasting partnership with William H. Herndon, a younger man who admired him greatly. By the mid-1840s, Abraham Lincoln was a respected lawyer, an experienced legislator, and a recognized figure in Illinois Whig politics. Springfield had indeed provided the fertile ground for his star to begin its ascent. After years of dedicated work in Illinois law and state politics, Abraham Lincoln set his sights on a larger stage, the United States Congress. In 1846, he successfully secured the Whig nomination and was subsequently elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. This notable achievement marked his first, and, as events would later unfold, his only term in national office before his presidency. In the autumn of 1847, accompanied by his wife Mary and their 2 young sons, Robert and Eddie, he made the journey to Washington, D.C. The nation's capital was a world away from the familiar surroundings of Springfield, a place with more entrenched political traditions and far more intense national debates. The move was a significant professional risk, but a necessary one for a man of his escalating political ambitions. One of the most significant issues consuming the political oxygen in Washington at that particular time was the ongoing Mexican-American War, which had commenced in 1846. President James K. Polk, a Democrat, ardently championed the war. He presented it as a necessary and just response to Mexican aggression, and also as a fulfillment of America's manifest destiny to expand its territorial domain westward. However, the conflict was deeply divisive across the nation. Many Whigs, and Abraham Lincoln counted himself among them, regarded the war with considerable skepticism and concern. They questioned its true necessity and harbored suspicions that it was largely an endeavor to acquire new territories into which the institution of slavery could expand, thereby unfortunately increasing the political power of the Southern states. This underlying tension about slavery's expansion defined the national mood. Once he took his seat in Congress, Representative Lincoln did not hesitate to make his opposition to the war, or at least to the Polk administration's justifications for it, quite clear. He was particularly critical of President Polk's assertion that hostilities had begun when Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. In December of 1847, Lincoln introduced a series of pointed resolutions that soon became known as the Spot Resolutions. These resolutions persistently and publicly questioned President Polk, urging him to identify the precise spot where American blood had first been shed. This was a direct challenge to the administration's claim that the conflict had legitimately begun on U.S. territory. While the Spot Resolutions certainly demonstrated Lincoln's keen legal mind and his personal courage in directly challenging a popular wartime president, they were not universally well received, even by some folks back in his home state of Illinois. Some of his constituents viewed his critical stance as unpatriotic and he consequently faced a measure of criticism in newspapers. For Abraham Lincoln, however, it was a deeply felt matter of principle. He was questioning what he saw as executive overreach and probing the moral implications of the war itself. His experience with this contentious issue clearly highlighted the complexities and often harsh realities of national politics, where taking a principled stand could invite significant public backlash and misunderstanding. Beyond the immediate controversies of the Mexican-American War, Lincoln's term in Congress also exposed him much more directly to the escalating and deeply troubling national debate over slavery. The question of whether slavery would be permitted in any new territories that might be acquired from Mexico was an incredibly contentious one, threatening to tear at the fabric of the Union. He gave his support to the Wilmot Proviso, a legislative proposal that aimed to stipulate that slavery should be firmly barred from any such newly acquired territories. Though the proviso repeatedly failed to pass the Senate, its recurring introduction was a clear indication of the growing anti-slavery sentiment in the northern states. Lincoln also at one point drafted a bill for the gradual compensated emancipation of enslaved people in the District of Columbia, though this, too, failed to gain sufficient traction to become law. Despite his active participation on these major and often volatile issues, Abraham Lincoln's single term serving in the House of Representatives was, by his own later and candid estimation, somewhat unremarkable in terms of tangible legislative achievements. He was, after all, a freshman congressman hailing from a still-developing frontier state, often a lone Whig voice among many more established figures. He diligently delivered speeches, served on various committees, and attended to the specific needs and requests of his constituents back in Illinois. But he did not emerge as a dominant or commanding national figure during this particular period. He reportedly experienced a sense of ineffectiveness at times, a frustrating feeling that his contributions were not making a truly significant impact on the grand and often turbulent stage of national affairs. He found the machinery of Washington slow and resistant to change. It had been something of a Whig tradition in his particular congressional district in Illinois to rotate the nomination, thereby allowing different qualified individuals an opportunity to serve. In keeping with this established understanding, and perhaps also influenced by his own personal sense of limited accomplishment or impact while in Washington, Lincoln did not seek re-election in 1848. He did, however, actively campaign for Zachary Taylor, the Whig presidential candidate that year. He had harbored some hope for a significant federal appointment, specifically as commissioner of the General Land Office following Taylor's victory. However, this coveted appointment ultimately did not materialize. He was instead offered the governorship of the distant Oregon Territory, a position which, after careful consideration, he chose to decline. So in 1849, after his term in Congress officially ended, Abraham Lincoln returned to Springfield and to the familiar demands of his law practice. His time spent in Washington, though perhaps not fulfilling all his initial political ambitions, had undeniably been an education. It had provided him with a valuable first-hand perspective on the intricate workings of the federal government, the sheer intensity of national debates, particularly concerning the omnipresent issue of slavery, and the formidable challenges inherent in trying to achieve meaningful change on that larger, more complex stage. While possibly feeling a degree of disappointment with his congressional career, he returned to Illinois, enriched with new perspectives and a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the powerful forces that were shaping and increasingly threatening the Union he held so dear. Following his return to Springfield in 1849, Abraham Lincoln re-immersed himself with characteristic diligence into his legal career. The subsequent years, stretching forward into the early 1850s, are sometimes retrospectively referred to by historians as his political wilderness years. Having completed his single term in Congress and not immediately pursuing another elective office on the national stage, he focused his considerable energies primarily on the practice of law. This period, however, was far from being a quiet or unproductive interlude in his life. It was, in fact, a time of significant professional growth, continued intellectual development, and quiet observation, even as the nation itself was almost imperceptibly inching ever closer to a profound and unavoidable crisis. He became a master of his profession, unwittingly preparing himself for the greatest political test imaginable. Lincoln's reputation as a highly skilled, meticulously prepared, and eminently trustworthy lawyer continued to solidify throughout Illinois. He, along with his junior partner William H. Herndon, who greatly admired Lincoln, built one of the most successful and respected legal practices in the state. Abraham was particularly renowned for his extensive work on the Eighth Judicial Circuit. This demanding role required him to travel extensively by horse and buggy alongside judges and fellow lawyers to various county seats twice each year when court was in session. This itinerant lifestyle, while often challenging, kept him in constant and direct contact with a wide and diverse array of people: hard-working farmers, ambitious merchants, skilled artisans, and fellow members of the bar. It allowed him to listen to their varied concerns, understand their unique perspectives, and further hone his already remarkable ability to connect with ordinary citizens on a human level. His legal casework during these years was incredibly varied and reflected the broad spectrum of issues facing a developing society. He handled everything from relatively small debt collections and complicated land title disputes to more complex cases involving business contracts, emerging patent law, and serious criminal defense matters. One particular area where he became especially prominent was in litigation involving the burgeoning railroad industry. As iron horses began to rapidly expand their reach across the prairies of Illinois, and indeed the entire nation, they brought with them a host of novel legal challenges. These often related to land acquisition for rights of way, the interpretation of corporate charters, questions of liability, and the regulation of this powerful new form of transport. Lincoln represented railroads in several significant cases, showcasing his legal acumen, but he also conscientiously took cases against them when justice required, underscoring his unwavering commitment to the fair application of the law rather than to any particular special interest group. These railroad cases were often quite lucrative, and they further enhanced his growing reputation for thorough preparation and clear, persuasive argumentation in court. While he was deeply and successfully engaged in his demanding legal practice, Abraham Lincoln did not entirely abandon his keen interest in the political sphere. He remained a steadfastly loyal Whig and frequently spoke at political gatherings and rallies, actively campaigning for various Whig candidates during election seasons. However, the Whig Party itself, the political home he had known for so long, was beginning to show undeniable signs of serious internal fracture. These divisions were largely, though not exclusively, over the increasingly contentious and morally charged issue of slavery. The Compromise of 1850, a complex package of legislation intended by its proponents to settle disputes over slavery in newly acquired Western territories, provided only a temporary and deeply uneasy truce. The nation was becoming visibly more polarized with each passing year, and the old, established political alignments were clearly struggling to maintain their coherence. For Abraham, this period of intense focus on his legal work also provided him with considerable and welcome opportunity for extensive reading and deep personal reflection. He faithfully continued his lifelong habit of rigorous self-education. He delved into works of history, finding lessons in the past. He read poetry, appreciating its beauty and emotional depth. He even reportedly studied Euclid's Elements of Geometry, not to become a mathematician, but to further improve his capacity for logical reasoning and precise argument. He also explored texts on political economy, seeking to understand the forces shaping society and commerce. This disciplined intellectual activity sharpened his already formidable mind and significantly broadened his understanding of complex social and political issues. It was, in essence, a time of quiet but profound internal growth, subtly preparing him in ways he could not yet fully foresee for the immense and unprecedented challenges that lay on the horizon. The relative political calm that Abraham Lincoln had been experiencing was abruptly shattered in the year 1854. This was due to the passage of the highly controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. This piece of legislation, notably championed by his fellow Illinoisan, Senator Stephen A. Douglas, effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That earlier compromise had for decades prohibited slavery in territories north of the parallel. The Kansas-Nebraska Act in its place introduced the principle of popular sovereignty. This doctrine allowed settlers in newly forming territories to decide for themselves, through a local vote, whether or not to permit the institution of slavery within their borders. This act was nothing short of a political earthquake. It outraged a great many people in the northern states, including Abraham Lincoln, who viewed it as a dangerous and morally reprehensible concession to Southern slaveholding interests and a profound betrayal of the nation's founding principles regarding human liberty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had the immediate effect of reigniting Abraham Lincoln's passion for politics with a newfound intensity and an unmistakable moral focus. He was, as he himself later stated with characteristic directness, aroused as he had never been before. He clearly saw the potential expansion of slavery not merely as a political issue to be debated, but as a profound moral wrong that actively threatened the very foundations of the American Republic. He began to speak out with great force and conviction against the act and its far-reaching implications. His speeches during this pivotal period were marked by a new depth of moral conviction and a powerfully clear articulation of the anti-slavery case. This case was built both on fundamental moral principles and on his careful interpretation of the intentions of the nation's founding fathers. This re-entry into the heated political arena was not a reluctant one for Lincoln. Despite his earlier disappointments with his congressional term, the rapidly escalating crisis over the future of slavery in the nation provided him with a cause that resonated deeply with his most fundamental core beliefs. The preceding wilderness years, though primarily filled with diligent legal work and quiet, intensive study, had inadvertently prepared him exceptionally well for this critical moment. He had meticulously honed his considerable skills as a debater, a profound thinker, and an effective communicator. Now, with the nation clearly facing what he considered to be its gravest challenge since its inception, Abraham Lincoln was ready, willing, and eminently able to step back onto the public stage. His voice now carrying a renewed and compelling sense of urgency and a profound moral authority that was hard to ignore. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 was not just a legislative change. It was a seismic event that sent shock waves across the American political landscape. It dramatically reshaped existing alliances and propelled Abraham Lincoln with renewed vigor back into the forefront of the burgeoning anti-slavery movement by permitting the potential expansion of slavery into new territories based on the principle of popular sovereignty. The act effectively swept aside the Missouri Compromise, a boundary that had for over 3 decades attempted to limit slavery's spread. This legislative upheaval deeply angered many Northerners. They saw it as a dangerous capitulation, opening vast Western lands to an institution they increasingly condemned as a moral stain on the nation and a direct threat to the principles of free labor. Abraham Lincoln was prominent among those who were profoundly disturbed by this turn of events. In response, he delivered a series of remarkably powerful speeches during the latter part of 1854. One of his most notable addresses was given in Peoria, Illinois. In these speeches, he meticulously and clearly articulated his strong opposition to both the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the broader principle of allowing slavery to extend its reach. His arguments were characterized by careful research, impeccable logical structure, and a delivery infused with compelling moral earnestness. He consistently argued that the Founding Fathers had envisioned a future where slavery was placed on a course of ultimate extinction. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, he contended, represented a perilous and unacceptable deviation from this original American intent. He passionately decried what he termed the new position that slavery should be treated as a matter of mere indifference, insisting instead on recognizing its inherent and profound injustice. The intense political turmoil and public outcry generated by the Kansas-Nebraska Act soon led to the rapid disintegration of the existing Whig Party, the political organization to which Abraham Lincoln had long maintained his allegiance. The Whigs found themselves deeply and irreparably divided over the pervasive issue of slavery, rendering them unable to formulate or maintain a unified national stance. Consequently, anti-slavery Whigs, alongside disillusioned Northern Democrats and members of the smaller Free Soil Party, began to search for a new political home. They started to coalesce around a new unifying banner. This widespread movement culminated in the formation of the Republican Party, a new political entity founded squarely on the core principle of vigorously opposing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. After some initial characteristic caution and thoughtful consideration, Abraham Lincoln aligned himself decisively with this new and dynamic party. His role in the establishment and subsequent growth of the Republican Party within the state of Illinois was undeniably significant. His well-earned reputation for unwavering integrity, his formidable intellectual prowess, and his increasingly powerful oratory made him a natural and respected leader within the emerging organization. He dedicated considerable effort to unifying the diverse and sometimes disparate factions that constituted the early Republican coalition. He consistently emphasized their shared commitment to the crucial goal of preventing slavery from spreading any further. He astutely understood that for the new party to achieve success, it needed to appeal to a broad range of voters. These were individuals who, while perhaps not all staunch abolitionists, were nevertheless deeply concerned about what they perceived as the aggressive and expansionist posture of the Southern slave power. Meanwhile, the situation in the Kansas Territory itself tragically devolved into open violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed with increasing ferocity in a bitter struggle to control the territory's future. This brutal and protracted conflict soon became known across the nation as Bleeding Kansas. These violent events further inflamed national passions and served to underscore the profound and dangerous divisions that the Kansas-Nebraska Act had tragically unleashed upon the country. For Abraham Lincoln and many other observers in the North, these events were a grim and bloody illustration of the dire consequences that arose when the nation strayed from its founding principles regarding human freedom and self-governance. The doctrine of popular sovereignty, far from being a peaceful solution, appeared in practice to lead only to further bloodshed, deeper animosity, and a fractured society. In June of 1858, a pivotal moment arrived in Lincoln's political career. He was officially nominated by the Illinois Republican Party to run for a seat in the United States Senate. His opponent was the incumbent, Stephen A. Douglas, the very architect of the controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. Upon accepting this important nomination, Lincoln delivered one of the most renowned and consequential speeches of his entire career. This address was given at the state Republican convention, which was held in Springfield. It has since become famously known as the House Divided Speech, a title drawn from its most memorable and impactful lines. Its central message served as a stark and unambiguous warning about the precarious future of the Union. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Abraham Lincoln declared powerfully, quoting a passage from the Gospels to underscore his point. He continued, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." This was an exceptionally bold and, for its time, somewhat radical public statement. Many observers, including some of his own supporters, initially perceived it as being too extreme, fearing it would alienate moderate voters who still hoped for compromise. However, Lincoln had become firmly convinced that the nation was on an inexorable path towards a fundamental crisis, one that could not be perpetually avoided by further political The House Divided Speech perfectly and incisively framed the central issue not only of the upcoming senatorial campaign against Douglas, but also of the larger, all-consuming national debate. It strategically positioned Lincoln as a man of profound principle, one who was unwilling to shy away from confronting the hard and uncomfortable truths that were facing the country. He was forcefully arguing that Stephen Douglas's cherished doctrine of popular sovereignty, far from offering a viable solution to the slavery issue, was actually exacerbating the dangerous division by allowing for slavery's potential and seemingly endless expansion. This powerful speech, with its unforgettable imagery and its clear, unwavering articulation of the immense stakes involved, effectively set the stage for an epic series of public confrontations with his formidable political rival, Stephen Douglas. A contest of ideas and wills that would soon capture the rapt attention of the entire nation. The 1858 Illinois Senate race set the stage for an extraordinary political contest, pitting Abraham Lincoln, the determined Republican challenger, against Stephen A. Douglas, the powerful Democratic incumbent. Douglas, widely known across the nation as the Little Giant due to his short physical stature but formidable political influence and debating prowess, was a towering figure in American politics at the time. Abraham Lincoln, while highly respected within Illinois for his intellect and integrity, was considerably less known on the national stage. The ensuing campaign between these two contrasting figures centered squarely on the most divisive and morally charged issue of the era, slavery, quickly evolved into a series of landmark public confrontations that would come to be known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates, captivating the attention of the entire nation. Recognizing the immense public interest in their sharply contrasting positions and the critical importance of the issues at stake, Abraham Lincoln took the initiative and challenged Stephen Douglas to a series of face-to-face debates to be held across the state of Illinois. After some negotiation, Douglas, confident in his well-honed debating abilities, eventually agreed to 7 joint appearances. These were scheduled to take place in different towns, one in each of the state's congressional districts, where they had not already both spoken during the campaign. These were not debates in the tightly structured, time-constrained format familiar to modern audiences. Instead, one candidate would typically open with an hour-long address. The other would then have a full hour and a half for a detailed reply, and the first speaker would conclude with a half-hour rebuttal. Enormous crowds, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, flocked to towns like Ottawa, Freeport, Galesburg, and Alton, eager to witness these compelling intellectual duels firsthand. The debates became a spectacular display of political oratory and ideological conflict. The very core of their protracted arguments revolved around the contentious place of slavery within American society and, most critically, its potential for expansion into the newly forming Western territories. Stephen Douglas consistently championed his doctrine of popular sovereignty. He forcefully argued that the people residing in each territory should have the democratic right to decide for themselves, through their local legislatures, whether to permit or prohibit slavery within their borders. He presented this as the most democratic and fair solution, one that respected the principle of local self-government and avoided imposing a federal mandate on the issue. Douglas often accused Lincoln and the Republican Party of being radical abolitionists who sought to disrupt the Union and interfere with the established rights of Southern states. He also frequently appealed to racist sentiments, asserting that the American government was made by white men for white men. Abraham Lincoln, by contrast, adopted a steadfast moral opposition to the expansion of human bondage. At this juncture in his political career, he wisely refrained from demanding the immediate dissolution of slavery in the states where it was already secured, recognizing the constitutional limits and existing legal protections. Nonetheless, he forcefully resisted its advance into any new territory. Lincoln articulated his stance clearly. He saw slavery as a profound moral, social, and political detriment. He maintained that the nation's founders had understood slavery to be an unfortunate evil they had tolerated only with the expectation that it would eventually be confined and placed on a path to ultimate extinction. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Douglas's doctrine of popular sovereignty, Lincoln insisted, represented a perilous departure from this foundational promise, effectively bestowing legitimacy upon slavery and opening the door for its unending spread and permanence. Lincoln masterfully employed both historical evidence and poignant appeals to the Declaration of Independence's central tenet, that all men are created equal, to buttress his position. However, his public communication often required him to carefully maneuver around the deep-seated racial prejudices prevalent throughout the country at the time. A particularly memorable moment of the campaign unfolded during the debate in Freeport, Illinois. Lincoln, with the calculated skill of a seasoned attorney, cornered Douglas by challenging him to reconcile his cherished principle of popular sovereignty with the recent, highly volatile Dred Scott Supreme Court decision of 1857. That infamous ruling had unequivocally stated two things: that Congress had no constitutional authority to bar slavery from the territories, and that people of African descent were not, and could never be, U.S. citizens. Douglas's carefully crafted rebuttal, instantly dubbed the Freeport Doctrine, was a desperate attempt to salvage his political standing and the concept of popular sovereignty. He proposed that regardless of the Supreme Court's ruling, the residents of a territory possessed the practical power to effectively prohibit slavery by simply refusing to enact the local laws and police ordinances necessary for the institution to function and thrive. A territory could, in essence, enforce an unfriendly legislation policy. While this strategic evasion arguably helped Douglas secure his re-election to the Senate in Illinois by appealing to a local desire to keep territories exclusively white, it severely alienated Southern Democrats. They viewed it as a direct betrayal of their constitutional rights, as explicitly affirmed by the Dred Scott verdict. This split irrevocably widened the fissures within the National Democratic Party. Throughout the course of the 7 debates, both formidable adversaries displayed remarkable command of language, sheer physical endurance, and intellectual sharpness. Douglas typically presented as the more aggressive figure, using his powerful, commanding voice and self-assured bearing to dominate the platforms. Lincoln, taller and initially appearing somewhat less polished, responded with his signature blend of incisive logical analysis, homespun anecdotal humor, devastatingly precise questions, and unwavering moral clarity. The extensive national press coverage of these debates, which often saw the complete text of the speeches reprinted, allowed citizens nationwide to follow the arguments closely. This massive exposure catapulted Abraham Lincoln's national standing, presenting him as an exceptionally thoughtful, articulate, and principled voice for the burgeoning anti-slavery movement across the northern states. In the final tally, Stephen A. Douglas secured the Senate seat. In a process common before the direct election of senators, the Illinois state legislature cast the deciding vote. The legislative district boundaries had been intentionally drawn to favor the Democratic Party, ensuring Douglas's victory despite the Republicans garnering a likely popular vote majority in the legislative races overall. Thus, Abraham Lincoln officially lost the Senate election. Yet, in a far grander sense, he secured a consequential, career-defining victory. The debates had transformed him from a respected regional politician into a truly national figure of influence. His unambiguous and principled opposition to the spread of slavery and his compelling articulation of the Republican agenda deeply impressed countless influential political leaders and ordinary citizens alike. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 stand as a watershed moment in American political history. They starkly revealed the deep and seemingly unbridgeable chasm over slavery that was relentlessly propelling the nation toward the chasm of disunion. Although denied the Senate seat, Lincoln emerged from this political furnace with his reputation significantly enhanced, his core principles sharply defined, and his position as the leading voice against the extension of slavery firmly and permanently solidified upon the national stage. The so-called giant killer, though not triumphant in this particular contest, had indelibly made his mark. Following the demanding senatorial contest and the nationally celebrated debates against Stephen Douglas in 1858, Abraham Lincoln found his reputation across the country dramatically amplified. Despite his election loss, his logical and eloquent defense of the Republican stance against slavery's expansion had reverberated far beyond the borders of Illinois. In late 1859, Lincoln received an unexpected invitation to deliver a lecture in New York City. The original venue was the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, a prominent location known for its strong abolitionist sentiment. The location was later shifted to the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in Manhattan, a larger and newer public assembly hall, for an address scheduled in February 1860. This speaking engagement presented Lincoln with a crucial, career-making chance to engage a highly sophisticated Eastern audience and unequivocally establish his bona fides as a serious national statesman with intellectual depth. Lincoln fully grasped the immense significance of this commitment. New York represented the epicenter of Northern media, finance, and political power. A commanding performance at Cooper Union could profoundly bolster his standing within the fragmented Republican Party and clearly position him as a viable, thoughtful, an electable leader as the nation looked ahead to the critical presidential election of 1860. Consequently, he devoted himself to preparing this speech with extraordinary diligence and meticulous historical research. He spent weeks, even months, diving deep into the public records, focusing specifically on the historical views and legislative actions of the 39 delegates who had signed the original United States Constitution regarding the federal government's authority over slavery in the territories. On the evening of February 27, 1860, Abraham Lincoln ascended the stage at Cooper Union before a large and highly influential audience. The crowd included many of New York's top political figures, powerful newspaper editors, esteemed intellectuals, and prominent citizens, many of whom were deeply curious to see and hear this somewhat plain-spoken, rustic lawyer from the West who had so effectively challenged the great Stephen Douglas. The initial impression Lincoln made was perhaps underwhelming. He was notably tall and spare, dressed in a relatively ill-fitting new suit, and his Western cadence was distinct. However, any quiet reservations the audience may have held quickly evaporated the moment he began to speak. His address was not a display of the soaring, emotion-driven oratory popular among many contemporary political speakers. Instead, it was an intellectual tour de force, a masterpiece of logical construction, rigorous historical analysis, and clear, forceful reasoning. The first, longest, and most detailed segment of the speech was devoted to systematically dismantling the Southern argument, frequently championed by Douglas, which claimed the founders understood the Constitution to explicitly forbid the federal government from legislating on slavery in the territories. Drawing heavily upon his exhaustive research, Lincoln methodically demonstrated, point by historical point, that a clear majority of the Constitution signers had, through their actions in Congress and other official capacities, consistently supported federal control over slavery in the territories. He meticulously documented their repeated votes for measures designed to restrict or outright prohibit slavery in federal lands, such as the Northwest Territory. This painstaking, almost legalistic presentation of historical evidence was highly effective and had a powerful impact on the sophisticated audience. It directly undercut the narrative promoted by both pro-slavery extremists and figures like Douglas, who sought the compromise of popular sovereignty. Lincoln convincingly argued that the Republican platform of restricting slavery's expansion was neither radical nor innovative, but was entirely consistent with the original understanding and intent of the nation's founders. He was, in effect, claiming the mantle of true conservatism for the Republican cause, aligning it with the nation's core, enduring principles rather than with disruptive political novelty. In the second portion of his address, Lincoln turned his attention directly to the people of the South, addressing them firmly, but without rancor. He acknowledged their stated grievances, but forcefully refuted their common accusations that Republicans were a sectional party intent on inciting slave insurrection. He made a calm, rational appeal to them to consider the facts honestly and abandon their threats of secession should a Republican win the presidency. He made it clear that Republicans had no intention of disturbing slavery where it already existed, respecting the constitutional guarantees, but that they would stand absolutely firm against its further expansion. Finally, in the concluding section, Lincoln rallied his fellow Republicans. He strongly urged them to stand by their core principles with courage and unwavering conviction, despite the accusations and intense threats emanating from the South. He famously and powerfully admonished them with a ringing call to action. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. This concluding statement, grounded in profound moral conviction and a call for steadfast purpose, resonated deeply. It was a message of quiet but formidable resolve, delivered with palpable authority. The Cooper Union Address was an immediate and resounding success. It was widely published in Northern newspapers, often printed in its entirety, and it dramatically boosted Lincoln's national stature. The initially skeptical New York audience was profoundly impressed by his intellectual command, thoroughness, and the compelling moral force of his reasoned argument. He had proven beyond doubt that he was not merely a folksy prairie debater, but a statesman of considerable depth and substance. The speech successfully countered any lingering perception that he was simply a one-issue candidate or an awkward Westerner. It established him as a principled, thoughtful, and, most importantly, electable leader, perfectly positioning him for the Republican presidential nomination just a few months later. The nation, or at least its highly influential centers, had indeed listened intently. The year 1860 proved to be a watershed year for both Abraham Lincoln and the fate of the United States. Following his compelling performance at Cooper Union and his continued, articulate opposition to slavery's expansion, his political stock within the Republican Party had risen exponentially. When Republicans convened their national convention in Chicago in May, Lincoln, despite entering the contest as an underdog against more established figures like William Seward, ultimately emerged as the party's presidential nominee after several ballots. His established reputation as Honest Abe, his inspiring biography, and his politically shrewd, moderate yet firm anti-slavery stance made him an exceptionally attractive candidate in a nation already on the verge of breakdown. The ensuing general election, however, was far from a conventional contest. The Democratic Party, which had long dominated national governance, catastrophically splintered over the singular issue of slavery. Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, whose platform adamantly insisted on federal protection for slavery in all territories. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's enduring rival, who continued to champion the compromise of popular sovereignty. A fourth entity, the Constitutional Union Party, emerged, nominating John Bell of Tennessee and attempting to find a hopeless middle ground by focusing only on preserving the Union and obeying the Constitution, effectively ignoring the slavery issue altogether. This four-way electoral contest created a dangerously volatile and wholly unpredictable political landscape. In keeping with the prevailing tradition for presidential hopefuls, Abraham Lincoln himself did not actively campaign. Instead, his enthusiastic grassroots supporters, most notably the Wide Awakes, uniformed young Republicans who organized massive parades, torchlight processions, and rallies, campaigned vigorously on his behalf. The Republican platform staunchly opposed the extension of slavery into any territories, but it was also broadened to include popular planks supporting a protective tariff, appealing to northern industry, a Homestead Act, appealing to Western settlers, and federal funding for a transcontinental railroad, appealing to a broad range of voters. Lincoln remained quietly in Springfield, receiving political visitors and corresponding with party leaders, privately confident but acutely aware of the existential stakes. When the election results were tallied on November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln had secured the presidency. However, his victory was a peculiar and deeply alarming one. He won a clear majority of the Electoral College votes, 180 to be exact, more than enough for a victory. But he achieved this solely by sweeping nearly all of the northern states, while failing to win a single slave state in the South. In fact, in 10 southern states, his name was not even printed on the ballot. Critically, he received only about 40% of the popular vote nationwide, meaning a decisive majority. Nearly 60% of voters had supported another candidate. This profoundly fractured victory underscored the massive, seemingly insurmountable sectional divide tearing the country asunder. The response in the deep southern states to Lincoln's election was immediate and highly alarming. Most Southerners viewed the Republican Party as fundamentally antagonistic to their agrarian way of life and, most crucially, to the institution of slavery upon which their entire social and economic structure was built. They interpreted Lincoln's victory, despite his consistent assurances that he would not interfere with slavery where it legally existed, as a dire, existential threat. For them, the ascent of a black Republican president signaled the beginning of the end for their cherished institutions and their political power within the Union. The intense rhetoric of secession, which had been threatening for years, now violently erupted. Before Abraham Lincoln even had a chance to take the sacred oath of office, the Union began its agonizing unraveling. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina formally declared its secession from the United States. Over the following weeks, 6 more Deep South states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed their lead. These states predicated their actions on the argument that the Union was a voluntary compact and that they possessed the inherent right to withdraw when they believed their fundamental rights were no longer being protected. They immediately began seizing federal installations, including military forts, arsenals, and custom houses within their newly claimed borders. The 4-month period between Lincoln's election in November and his inauguration in March 1861 was one of agonizing uncertainty and immense political pressure. The outgoing president, James Buchanan, proved largely ineffectual in halting the tide of secession. He believed secession was illegal, but simultaneously held the belief that the federal government lacked the constitutional power to coerce a state to remain in the Union. Meanwhile, President-elect Lincoln was placed in a supremely difficult position. He held no official executive power, yet was under constant pressure to issue public statements or offer concessions that might somehow stop the crisis. Lincoln mostly maintained a calculated public silence during these critical months, correctly believing that any statement he made would likely be twisted by his opponents and could further inflame the situation. He privately affirmed, however, that he would uphold the Constitution and that he considered secession to be illegal and an act of rebellion. He categorically rejected any proposal for compromise that would involve abandoning the core Republican principle of preventing slavery's expansion into the territories. As he prepared for the long train journey from Springfield to Washington for his inauguration, he faced the daunting, tragic prospect of taking charge of a nation that was literally and tragically coming apart at its seams. The unlikely president-elect was about to inherit a monumental, shattering crisis. The train journey Abraham Lincoln undertook from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C., in February 1861, for his inauguration was an unprecedented presidential transition. It was a passage across a nation teetering on the precipice of self-destruction. As his train proceeded eastward, stopping in various cities for public speeches and appearances, the very air was charged with profound tension and pervasive uncertainty. 7 states had already declared their secession, and the distinct possibility of further departures loomed large. There were even highly credible reports of assassination conspiracies targeting the president-elect, compelling him to drastically alter his travel itinerary and pass through Baltimore under the cover of night, escorted by heavy guard. During this frantic period, last-ditch efforts at legislative compromise continued in Washington, D.C., most notably the Crittenden Compromise. This proposal suggested several constitutional amendments to permanently protect slavery in the states where it currently existed and to effectively restore and extend the old Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean. Lincoln, however, while entirely willing to once again reassure the South of his lack of intent to interfere with existing slavery, stood firm against any compromise that would open the door for the expansion of slavery into new territories. This non-extension was the bedrock principle upon which he and the entire Republican Party had been elected, and he believed that abandoning it would constitute a betrayal of their mandate and ultimately fail to resolve the core underlying crisis. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood before a massive crowd assembled at the east portico of the still unfinished Capitol building to deliver his first inaugural address. His chosen words were meticulously measured, designed to strike a delicate balance between resolute firmness and sincere conciliation. He began by offering firm reassurances to the Southern states that he held no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. He explicitly stated, "I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Furthermore, he pledged to uphold the entire Constitution, including its provisions concerning the return of fugitive slaves. However, Lincoln then transitioned to an unequivocal assertion of the perpetuity of the Union. He argued persuasively that, legally speaking, the Union remained unbroken and that all acts of secession were therefore legally void. He declared his sworn, solemn oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and the government of the United States. He stated his unambiguous intent to hold, occupy, and possess federal property and to collect customs duties and imposts. Yet, he carefully added that there would be no initiation of force or any form of military invasion against the people anywhere unless it became absolutely necessary to achieve these stated objects. He shrewdly positioned the onus for any potential conflict squarely upon the seceding states. Perhaps the most poignant and memorable passage of his entire address was its concluding eloquent appeal to the Southern people. He earnestly pleaded with them to pause and reflect before taking any irrevocable steps toward war. He issued a solemn warning: "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors." He closed with a deeply moving call for national reconciliation. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." In his final, immortal lines, he invoked unity, the mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union. When again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Despite Lincoln's earnest, eloquent plea, the political and emotional forces driving disunion proved too formidable. Even as he spoke, the newly proclaimed Confederate States of America, led by its president, Jefferson Davis, was rapidly solidifying its own nascent government. One of the most immediate and pressing crises facing the new president was the precise status of Fort Sumter, a federal installation located strategically in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The fort was desperately running low on food and vital supplies, and its small Union garrison was completely encircled by increasingly hostile Confederate forces. To attempt to resupply the fort would certainly be viewed by the Confederacy as an overt act of military aggression. To abandon it would be a tacit, humiliating recognition of Confederate sovereignty. After intense deliberation and against the differing advice of some of his own cabinet members, Lincoln opted to dispatch a carefully limited, unarmed naval expedition to resupply Fort Sumter with provisions only. He immediately notified the governor of South Carolina of his purely peaceful, humanitarian intentions. However, the Confederate government, viewing any attempt to retain the federal fort as a direct challenge to its authority and legitimacy, chose to act decisively. On April 12, 1861, before the Union resupply mission could arrive, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. After a sustained, relentless bombardment lasting more than 30 hours, the Union garrison, entirely outgunned and overwhelmed, was finally forced to surrender the fort. The attack on Fort Sumter was the spark that ignited the Civil War. It instantly ended the months of anxious political maneuvering and forced both sides to commit fully to the path of armed conflict. In direct response to the bombardment of the fort, President Lincoln issued a formal proclamation on April 15th, calling forth 75,000 state militiamen to suppress the existing rebellion. This call for troops, in turn, prompted four additional crucial southern states: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to secede and officially join the Confederacy. The Union which Abraham Lincoln had so diligently and desperately sought to preserve through reason and peace was now tragically and irrevocably torn asunder. The immense, crushing weight of leading a divided nation through a catastrophic civil war now rested entirely upon his shoulders. With the fall of Fort Sumter and the subsequent presidential call for troops, the American Civil War commenced in deadly earnest. The initial surge of patriotic enthusiasm across both sides rapidly brought thousands of eager volunteers into the newly formed armies. However, President Abraham Lincoln quickly realized that national fervor alone would never win the war. He faced the monumental twin tasks of mobilizing the Union's superior industrial and demographic resources and, more acutely, finding military commanders who possessed the required blend of professional skill, sheer determination, and the aggressive fighting spirit necessary to defeat the Confederacy. This demanding search for effective, decisive military leadership would prove to be one of his most deeply frustrating and persistent challenges during the early, trying years of the conflict. The very first major engagement of the war, fought at Bull Run, or Manassas, in July 1861, ended in a shocking and deeply humbling defeat for the Union Army. The raw, inadequately trained Union troops, who had initially been overconfident of swift victory, were soundly routed by Confederate forces, sending them fleeing in chaotic disarray back towards Washington, D.C. This disastrous outcome instantly dispelled any lingering illusions that the war would be brief or easily won. It also starkly underscored the immediate, urgent need for vastly superior military training, organization, and, most critically, more competent generalship for the Union forces. Following the rout at Bull Run, Lincoln appointed General George B. McClellan to command the main Union force in the Eastern Theater, soon to be known as the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was an exceptionally brilliant organizer and administrator. He excelled at the critical tasks of drilling troops, constructing impressive defensive fortifications, and instilling a much-needed sense of discipline and professional pride in the Army. He was immensely popular with his men, who affectionately called him Little Mac. However, McClellan also exhibited a profoundly cautious, almost paralyzing, temperament when it came to committing his impeccably drilled army to actual battle. He possessed a relentless tendency to grossly overestimate the strength of the enemy and seemed perpetually reluctant to risk his beloved troops and aggressive offensive operations. President Lincoln, who as the commander-in-chief bore the ultimate responsibility for the war effort, grew increasingly exasperated with McClellan's chronic inaction. Lincoln, despite his own complete lack of formal military experience, possessed a keen, intuitive strategic mind. He diligently studied military strategy and tactics, trying to grasp the key principles of large-scale warfare. He repeatedly urged McClellan to move, to strike the enemy, and to decisively utilize the Union's obvious advantages in manpower and resources. Yet, McClellan perpetually delayed, continually demanding more men, more supplies, or more time for perfect preparation. His personal and professional relationship with Lincoln became severely strained, characterized by the general's often disrespectful attitude toward the president and Lincoln's own rising level of exasperation. Making the announcement after a succession of defeats, he argued, would make it appear as a desperate, last-gasp measure, a last shriek on the retreat of a failing cause. Lincoln, an astute politician and ever the pragmatist, recognized the wisdom in this strategic delay. He agreed to bide his time, patiently waiting for a more opportune moment to claim moral high ground following a success on the battlefield. That moment finally presented itself in September 1862, immediately following the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. While the battle itself was tactically inconclusive and ended in a bloody stalemate, it compelled Confederate General Robert Lee's army to halt its invasion and retreat back across the Potomac River from Northern Territory. Though not the overwhelming, decisive triumph Lincoln had fervently hoped for, it was sufficiently a Union success to provide the firm platform he required. Just 5 days after the battle, on September 22, 1862, President Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This powerful document stipulated that, as of January 1, 1863, all persons held as slaves in any state or designated part of state still engaged in open rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward, and forever free. The proclamation effectively granted the Confederate States a period of 100 days to cease their insurrection and rejoin the Union if they wished to circumvent the Edict of Emancipation and retain their peculiar institution. Predictably, none of the Confederate States complied. Consequently, on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln formally signed the final, operative Emancipation Proclamation. This landmark executive order declared freedom for all slaves within the actively rebellious territories. It is vital to acknowledge the document's deliberate limitations. For constitutional and political reasons tied to his war powers, it did not apply to enslaved people in the loyal border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, nor did it apply to those in Confederate regions already under effective Union military control. Lincoln legally justified these exclusions, contending that he could only emancipate slaves in territories currently in rebellion as an essential military necessity measure, aimed at crippling the enemy's war machine. The immediate, tangible impact of the proclamation was, in some ways, restricted. On the day of its signing, it directly freed very few slaves, as it applied only to areas where the Union government lacked any actual enforcement control. However, its symbolic and long-term consequences were colossal and game-changing. It fundamentally and permanently transformed the character of the war. The conflict was no longer solely a struggle to merely preserve the old Union. It was now explicitly a war for human liberty and to end slavery. This gave the Union cause a powerful, undeniable moral authority both domestically and on the global stage. making it virtually impossible for European powers like Great Britain and France to consider formally recognizing or supporting the Confederacy. Furthermore, the Emancipation Proclamation officially sanctioned and encouraged the recruitment of African American men into the Union Army and Navy. Thousands of formerly enslaved men and free Black Americans eagerly rushed to enlist, determined to fight for their own freedom and the ultimate liberation of their people. These soldiers, who eventually numbered nearly 200,000, served with immense courage, fortitude, and distinction, making an absolutely vital contribution to the Union war effort. Their participation served as a powerful, living testament to the proclamation's earth-shattering impact and the completely altered nature of the struggle. While the proclamation was not the legal terminus of slavery, a goal that would ultimately require a constitutional amendment, it represented a monumental, historic step, a promise of freedom that forever changed the trajectory of American history, guided by Abraham Lincoln's evolving moral conviction and his steadfast courage. The summer of 1863 would prove to be the most pivotal period in the entire American Civil War, defined by two consequential Union victories that irrevocably shifted the strategic balance and finally offered a tangible sense of hope to a war-weary North. These monumental triumphs occurred almost simultaneously in early July. At Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in the east, and at Vicksburg, Mississippi, in the west. For President Abraham Lincoln, who had endured so many months of agonizing military setbacks and frustration, these successes offered much-needed validation of the Union's eventual victory and his steadfast leadership. In the crucial Eastern Theater, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, newly emboldened by his decisive prior victory at Chancellorsville, launched his second, ambitious invasion of the North. His calculated gamble was to win a decisive, annihilating battle on Union soil, which he hoped would shatter Northern public morale, pressure foreign powers into formal recognition of the Confederacy, and perhaps even force Lincoln's government to accept a negotiated peace settlement. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed into Pennsylvania, where it unexpectedly encountered the Union Army of the Potomac, now under the very new command of General George Meade, near the small town of Gettysburg. The ensuing confrontation, fought over 3 brutal, relentless days from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, remains the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on the North American continent. The fighting at Gettysburg was desperate and ferocious, with soldiers on both sides displaying immense bravery while suffering catastrophic casualties. Key turning points included the savage struggles for strategic high ground like Little Round Top, Culp's Hill, and the Peach Orchard. The dramatic climax of the battle unfolded on the 3rd day with Pickett's charge, a massive Confederate infantry assault launched against the heavily fortified center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The charge, though carried out with incredible valor, was repulsed with devastating, staggering losses for the Confederates. Unable to achieve any of his core objectives, and having suffered irreplaceable troop losses, General Lee was forced to order a strategic retreat back into Virginia. Making the announcement after a succession of defeats, he argued, would make it appear as a desperate, last-gasp measure, a last shriek on the retreat of a failing cause. Lincoln, an astute politician and ever the pragmatist, recognized the wisdom in this strategic delay. He agreed to bide his time, patiently waiting for a more opportune moment to claim moral high ground following a success on the battlefield. That moment finally presented itself in September 1862, immediately following the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. While the battle itself was tactically inconclusive and ended in a bloody stalemate, it compelled Confederate General Robert Lee's army to halt its invasion and retreat back across the Potomac River from Northern Territory. Though not the overwhelming, decisive triumph Lincoln had fervently hoped for, it was sufficiently a Union success to provide the firm platform he required. Just 5 days after the battle, on September 22, 1862, President Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This powerful document stipulated that, as of January 1, 1863, all persons held as slaves in any state or designated part of state still engaged in open rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward, and forever free. The proclamation effectively granted the Confederate States a period of 100 days to cease their insurrection and rejoin the Union if they wished to circumvent the Edict of Emancipation and retain their peculiar institution. Predictably, none of the Confederate States complied. Consequently, on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln formally signed the final, operative Emancipation Proclamation. This landmark executive order declared freedom for all slaves within the actively rebellious territories. It is vital to acknowledge the document's deliberate limitations. For constitutional and political reasons tied to his war powers, it did not apply to enslaved people in the loyal border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, nor did it apply to those in Confederate regions already under effective Union military control. Lincoln legally justified these exclusions, contending that he could only emancipate slaves in territories currently in rebellion as an essential military necessity measure, aimed at crippling the enemy's war machine. The immediate, tangible impact of the proclamation was, in some ways, restricted. On the day of its signing, it directly freed very few slaves, as it applied only to areas where the Union government lacked any actual enforcement control. However, its symbolic and long-term consequences were colossal and game-changing. It fundamentally and permanently transformed the character of the war. The conflict was no longer solely a struggle to merely preserve the old Union. It was now explicitly a war for human liberty and to end slavery. This gave the Union cause a powerful, undeniable moral authority both domestically and on the global stage, making it virtually impossible for European powers like Great Britain and France to consider formally recognizing or supporting the Confederacy. Furthermore, the Emancipation Proclamation officially sanctioned and encouraged the recruitment of African American men into the Union Army and Navy. Thousands of formerly enslaved men and free Black Americans eagerly rushed to enlist, determined to fight for their own freedom and the ultimate liberation of their people. These soldiers, who eventually numbered nearly 200,000, served with immense courage, fortitude, and distinction, making an absolutely vital contribution to the Union war effort. Their participation served as a powerful, living testament to the proclamation's earth-shattering impact and the completely altered nature of the struggle. While the proclamation was not the legal terminus of slavery, a goal that would ultimately require a constitutional amendment, it represented a monumental, historic step, a promise of freedom that forever changed the trajectory of American history, guided by Abraham Lincoln's evolving moral conviction and his steadfast courage. The summer of 1863 would prove to be the most pivotal period in the entire American Civil War, defined by two consequential Union victories that irrevocably shifted the strategic balance and finally offered a tangible sense of hope to a war-weary North. These monumental triumphs occurred almost simultaneously in early July. At Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in the east, and at Vicksburg, Mississippi, in the west. For President Abraham Lincoln, who had endured so many months of agonizing military setbacks and frustration, These successes offered much-needed validation of the Union's eventual victory and his steadfast leadership. In the crucial Eastern Theater, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, newly emboldened by his decisive prior victory at Chancellorsville, launched his second, ambitious invasion of the North. His calculated gamble was to win a decisive, annihilating battle on Union soil, which he hoped would shatter Northern public morale, pressure foreign powers into formal recognition of the Confederacy, and perhaps even force Lincoln's government to accept a negotiated peace settlement. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed into Pennsylvania, where it unexpectedly encountered the Union Army of the Potomac, now under the very new command of General George Meade, near the small town of Gettysburg. The ensuing confrontation, fought over 3 brutal, relentless days from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, remains the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on the North American continent. The fighting at Gettysburg was desperate and ferocious, with soldiers on both sides displaying immense bravery while suffering catastrophic casualties. Key turning points included the savage struggles for strategic high ground like Little Round Top, Culp's Hill, and the Peach Orchard. The dramatic climax of the battle unfolded on the 3rd day with Pickett's charge, a massive Confederate infantry assault launched against the heavily fortified center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The charge, though carried out with incredible valor, was repulsed with devastating, staggering losses for the Confederates. Unable to achieve any of his core objectives, and having suffered irreplaceable troop losses, General Lee was forced to order a strategic retreat back into Virginia. The summer of 1864 was a particularly bleak period for Lincoln and the Union cause. General Ulysses S. Grant, now in supreme command of all Union armies, was engaged in a relentless, yet hideously bloody, campaign against General Robert E. Lee's forces in Virginia. Battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor produced horrific Union casualties, leading some in the North to unfairly label Grant a butcher. This seemingly endless slaughter without a clear, decisive victory in the East severely eroded public morale. Many people began to genuinely despair that the war could ever be won, or that if it could, the cost would be too devastating to bear. Abraham Lincoln himself became deeply pessimistic about his prospects for re-election during this harrowing period. He confided in close friends and colleagues that he fully expected to lose. In late August, he went so far as to write a private, blind memorandum which he asked his cabinet members to sign without reading the contents. In it, he solemnly pledged that if he lost the election, he would cooperate fully with the president-elect to save the Union before the inauguration, as he believed the new president would likely operate on a platform that might lead to the Union's swift dissolution if the war was not won quickly. This remarkable document revealed the depth of his concern for the nation's survival, even above his own political future. However, just when the political situation seemed darkest for Lincoln, events on the battlefield began to shift the tide decisively. On September 2nd, 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman captured the strategically vital city of Atlanta, Georgia. This victory was a massive blow to Confederate morale and provided an enormous, much-needed boost to Northern public sentiment. Sherman's success powerfully signaled that the Union strategy of total war was yielding clear results, and that the Confederacy's ability to resist was perhaps finally and fatally waning. Additionally, Admiral David Farragut won a significant naval victory at Mobile Bay, Alabama, further tightening the crucial Union blockade. These critical military successes dramatically altered the political calculus. They reinvigorated support for Lincoln and the National Union Party. The Democratic argument that the war was a failure became almost impossible to sustain in the face of such triumphs. Lincoln's steadfast, unwavering leadership, once viewed by some as a liability, now appeared as a potent source of strength and determined resolve. The Democratic platform, with its call for a negotiated peace, increasingly seemed like an admission of defeat just when final victory appeared to be within grasp. When the election was held in November 1864, Abraham Lincoln won a resounding victory. He carried all but 3 states, New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky, securing a decisive 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. He also won a comfortable majority of the popular vote, a significant improvement over his 1860 performance. Perhaps most tellingly, he received overwhelming support from the Union soldiers who were able to cast their ballots from the field. Their votes were a powerful, undeniable endorsement of his leadership and their collective desire to see the war through to a successful conclusion. Lincoln's re-election was a clear, emphatic mandate to continue the fight to preserve the Union and, implicitly, to ensure the permanent end of slavery. The nation, though still deeply scarred and mourning its losses, had chosen to stay the course with the president who had guided it through its darkest hours. By the time Abraham Lincoln prepared to deliver his second inaugural address on March 4, 1865, the Civil War was unmistakably drawing to its agonizing close. Union armies under General Grant were relentlessly tightening their grip on General Lee's forces in Virginia, and General Sherman's troops had carved a path of destruction and military success through Georgia and the Carolinas. The Confederacy was undeniably crumbling. Its capacity to sustain the war effort was all but exhausted. Washington, D.C., on that inauguration day, was a city filled with a distinct mixture of weary relief, confident anticipation of victory, and a profound, shared sense of the immense sacrifices that had been made. The mood was markedly different from the pervasive fear and uncertainty that had shrouded his first inauguration 4 years earlier. The weather on that March day was initially rainy and bleak, perhaps mirroring the somber years of conflict. However, as Lincoln rose to speak from the east portico of the Capitol, the sun reportedly broke through the clouds, a dramatic moment that many observers instantly interpreted as a hopeful omen for the future. The crowd before him was large and diverse, notably including many African American citizens, some of whom were soldiers in the Union Army, a powerful testament to the profound, transformative changes the war had irrevocably wrought. Unlike many inaugural addresses, Lincoln's second was remarkably short, consisting of just over 700 words, yet it remains one of the most profound and eloquent speeches in all of American history. He began by acknowledging that there was less occasion for an extended address than there had been at his first inauguration. The visible progress of Union arms, he noted with characteristic understatement, was reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. He stated that he would not dwell on specific predictions for the future, as the situation, though hopeful, was still fraught with uncertainty. Instead of a triumphal speech celebrating impending victory or vehemently denouncing the defeated enemy, Lincoln offered something far more reflective, humble, and deeply philosophical. He sought to find a deeper, spiritual meaning in the terrible ordeal the nation had endured and, most importantly, to set a necessary tone for the immense and challenging task of reconciliation that lay immediately ahead. A significant portion of the address was devoted to exploring the causes and the divine interpretation of the war, focusing particularly on the central issue of slavery. Lincoln noted the bitter, profound irony that both North and South read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. He then confronted the deep moral paradox of slavery. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. This was not a statement of moral relativism, but rather an appeal for national humility and a public recognition of shared human fallibility. He then offered a powerful, complex theological interpretation of the war's immense suffering. He suggested that slavery was an offense that God perhaps now wills to remove, and that the terrible war itself might be a divine retribution visited upon both North and South for their national complicity in the institution of slavery. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away, he said. Yet, he continued with his sobering assessment. Yet, if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. This was a stark, sobering assessment, acknowledging a shared national sin and the profound potential for divine justice. Having explored the war's deeper spiritual meanings, Lincoln then turned with unwavering focus towards the future, outlining the precise spirit in which the nation should approach the monumental task of rebuilding and reconciliation. It is in these concluding words that the speech reaches its emotional and moral zenith. He did not speak of punishment for the defeated South or of glory for the victorious North. Instead, he called for a spirit of profound magnanimity and compassion, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. These concluding words, delivered with a quiet but immense solemnity, offered a vision of a reunited nation moving forward not with vengeance, but with forgiveness and a shared commitment to national healing. Lincoln's second inaugural address was not universally acclaimed at the time. Some in the North found it too forgiving, too lacking in triumphalism. Yet, over time, it has become recognized as a masterpiece of political and moral literature. It stands as a timeless testament to his profound empathy and his unwavering commitment to achieving a just and merciful peace. In the early spring of 1865, immediately following Abraham Lincoln's poignant second inaugural address, the Civil War moved inexorably and swiftly towards its inevitable conclusion. The terrible swift sword of Union military power, as immortalized in the battle hymn of the Republic, was now striking its final, decisive blows against a weakened and exhausted Confederacy. General Ulysses S. Grant, with his characteristic relentless determination, continued to press his tight siege of Petersburg, Virginia, a critical supply and railroad hub for the Confederate capital of Richmond and General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The strategic situation for the Confederacy was becoming catastrophically dire. General William T. Sherman's Union forces, having completed their destructive yet strategically vital march to the sea through Georgia, had turned north and were now advancing through the Carolinas, further crippling the Confederacy's logistical ability to sustain the war effort. Lee's army, trapped in the elaborate defenses around Petersburg and Richmond, was rapidly dwindling in numbers due to mounting casualties, mass desertions, and a severe lack of vital supplies. The Confederate soldiers were hungry, poorly clothed, and increasingly demoralized, though many still fought with a desperate courage born of loyalty to their cause and their esteemed commander. On April 2nd, 1865, Grant's forces finally achieved a decisive breakthrough of Lee's critically thin defensive lines at Petersburg. This breakthrough forced Lee to order the immediate evacuation of both Petersburg and Richmond. The Confederate government, including President Jefferson Davis, hastily fled the capital, which had stood as a defiant symbol of Southern resistance for 4 long years. The following day, April 3rd, Union troops, notably including regiments of African American soldiers, proudly marched into Richmond and raised the United States flag over the former Confederate Capitol building. The fall of Richmond was a momentous, symbolic event, signaling the immediate collapse of the Confederacy. President Lincoln himself, who had been at Grant's headquarters at City Point near Petersburg, visited the fallen Confederate capital on April 4th. His arrival was deliberately low-key and without a large military escort. As he walked through the devastated streets, he was greeted by scenes of destruction from recent fires, but also by large, ecstatic crowds of newly freed African Americans who thronged around him, cheering and expressing their overwhelming gratitude in deeply emotional displays. For them, Lincoln was nothing short of a liberator, the living embodiment of their long-awaited freedom. It was a powerful, deeply moving moment, underscoring the profound human consequences of the Union victory. Meanwhile, General Lee led his depleted and starving army of Northern Virginia westward from Richmond, desperately hoping to escape Grant's relentless pursuit and possibly link up with other remaining Confederate forces in North Carolina. However, Grant's larger, far better supplied Union army relentlessly pursued, expertly cutting off Lee's remaining avenues of retreat. The Confederate forces were utterly exhausted. Their situation was hopeless. Lee recognized that further resistance would only lead to more needless bloodshed and suffering for his men. On April 9th, 1865, Palm Sunday, General Robert E. Lee met with General Ulysses S. Grant at a small, private home in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. There, in a poignant and highly dignified encounter, Lee formally surrendered his army of Northern Virginia to Grant. The terms of surrender offered by Grant were remarkably generous and magnanimous, clearly reflecting President Lincoln's firm desire for a swift reconciliation rather than prolonged punishment. Confederate soldiers were permitted to keep their sidearms and personal horses, and they were paroled and allowed to return to their homes, provided they pledged not to take up arms against the United States again. Grant also immediately ordered that badly needed rations be provided to Lee's starving army. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, while not technically the end of all Confederate resistance, other smaller Confederate forces would surrender in the following weeks, was universally recognized as the effective end of the Civil War. News of Lee's surrender spread rapidly, setting off joyous, spontaneous celebrations across the entire North. Washington, D.C. erupted in a cacophony of cheers, cannon fire, and illuminated buildings. The 4 long, brutal years of conflict, which had claimed more than 600,000 American lives and torn the nation apart, were finally over. In the midst of this overwhelming national elation, Abraham Lincoln remained intently focused on the immense, complex task of national healing and reconstruction. He had long been developing his plans for restoring the Southern states to the Union, advocating for a lenient approach that would encourage swift reconciliation rather than prolonged punishment. On April 11th, just 2 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln delivered his last public address from a window of the White House. In this speech, he discussed his initial ideas for Reconstruction, focusing particularly on the state of Louisiana. He indicated his groundbreaking support for allowing some African American men, particularly veterans and the very intelligent, to vote. This was a tentative but historically significant step toward black suffrage. His primary, overarching goal, however, was to bring the nation back together, to bind up the nation's wounds, as he had so eloquently stated in his recent inaugural address. The terrible swift sword had done its work. Now, the vital work of peace and reunion had to immediately begin. The days immediately following General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse were filled with an unparalleled sense of relief and immense jubilation across the northern states. The brutal Civil War, after 4 long, agonizing years of relentless bloodshed and sacrifice, was effectively and gloriously over. Washington, D.C., in particular, was electric with spontaneous celebrations. President Abraham Lincoln, who had shouldered the immense, crushing burden of leadership through the nation's darkest trial, could finally look ahead to a future defined by peace and the complex work of reunification. He spoke openly of magnanimous reconciliation and began to focus his mind and energy more intensely on the daunting task of reconstructing the shattered South. Tragically, he would not live to see these hopeful plans realized. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, sought a few hours of well-deserved relaxation and entertainment. They made the decision to attend a performance of the wildly popular comedy, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington. General Ulysses S. Grant and his wife had initially been invited to join them, but they had declined, opting instead to travel out of the city. The presidential party, which also included a young officer, Major Henry Rathbone, and his fiancée, Clara Harris, arrived at the theater and settled into the presidential box, which was elegantly draped with American flags. During the third act of the play, at a moment calculated to coincide with a particularly funny line that typically drew loud laughter from the audience, a man silently slipped into the presidential box from the rear. This man was John Wilkes Booth, a highly recognizable actor and a fanatical Confederate sympathizer. Booth, fueled by a seething hatred for Lincoln and a desperate, misguided desire to somehow avenge the defeated South, was part of a broader conspiracy designed to assassinate several high-ranking Union officials that very night. As a professional actor, he knew the theater's layout intimately and had meticulously planned every detail of his desperate actions. Stealthily approaching the president from behind, John Wilkes Booth aimed a .44 caliber Derringer pistol at the back of Abraham Lincoln's head and fired a single, fatal shot at close range. Major Rathbone, instantly realizing the horror that had just unfolded, lunged at Booth, but the assassin slashed him severely on the arm with a large knife. Booth then dramatically leapt from the box onto the stage below, an estimated 12-foot drop, reportedly shouting, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia, adding the defiant claim that the South was avenged. Although he broke his left leg in the fall, Booth managed to momentarily escape the ensuing chaos, limping through a back exit of the theater where a horse was waiting for him. Chaos and immediate horror erupted inside Ford's Theater. Mary Lincoln screamed, and the entire audience was thrown into a state of stunned panic and disbelief. Doctors were instantly summoned to the presidential box. They found President Lincoln slumped motionlessly in his chair, mortally wounded. The bullet had entered the left side of his head and lodged irrevocably behind his right eye. It was agonizingly clear that the wound was fatal. With utmost care and reverence, A group of soldiers and doctors carried the unconscious president out of the theater and across the street to a modest lodging house owned by William Peterson, known as the Peterson House. He was laid diagonally upon a bed in a small back room, as his famously tall frame was too long for the standard bed. Throughout that long, agonizing, and sorrowful night, high-ranking government officials, cabinet members, and close friends kept a silent, solemn vigil by Lincoln's bedside. Mary Lincoln, completely overcome with debilitating grief, remained inconsolably in an adjoining room. The attending doctors could do absolutely nothing to reverse the trauma. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, never regained consciousness. He quietly passed away at 7:22 on the morning of April 15, 1865. Upon his final breath, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had maintained his vigil through much of the night, reportedly uttered the now immortal words, "Now he belongs to the ages," or perhaps, "Now he belongs to the angels." The immediate vacuum of leadership was filled as Vice President Andrew Johnson was quickly sworn in as the new president. As news of the assassination spread rapidly across the nation via the telegraph wires, the entire country was plunged into a state of profound shock and deep mourning. The joyous celebrations marking the war's conclusion were abruptly replaced by disbelief, outrage, and an overwhelming outpouring of collective grief. Flags were instantly lowered to half-mast. Businesses across the North closed their doors, and public buildings were sorrowfully draped in black crepe. People wept openly and unashamedly in the streets. The sense of loss was overwhelming and acutely personal. The man who had courageously saved the Union, who had guided the nation through its greatest existential crisis, and who had proclaimed emancipation for millions, had been struck down at the very moment of triumph and the promise of reconciliation. A massive, unprecedented manhunt was immediately launched for John Wilkes Booth and his known co-conspirators. Booth managed to elude capture for a period of 12 days, but he was eventually cornered in a tobacco barn in rural Virginia and was fatally shot on April 26th. Several other conspirators were promptly arrested, tried by a military commission, and either tragically hanged or imprisoned. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was a national tragedy of unparalleled proportions. It not only violently cut short the life of a truly great leader, but also cast a dark, ominous shadow over the early, critical years of Reconstruction, cruelly depriving the nation of his wisdom, profound compassion, and moral authority at a time when they were most desperately needed to knit the fractured nation back together. A guiding star had indeed been extinguished, and a unified nation mourned its fallen president with a depth of collective sorrow rarely, if ever, witnessed. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April 1865, occurring precisely as the Civil War was reaching its necessary conclusion, plunged the United States into an unprecedented period of sustained national mourning and existential uncertainty. The man who had skillfully navigated the nation through its most perilous crisis, preserved the Union at all costs, and championed the essential cause of human freedom was suddenly and violently gone. Yet, even as the country grieved its loss, the deep foundations of his enduring legacy were already firmly established. It was a legacy that would not only permanently shape the future course of America, but also resonate as a timeless beacon of liberty and democratic ideals around the world for countless generations to come. Lincoln's most immediate, tangible, and profound achievement was the preservation of the United States as a single, indivisible nation. When he first took office, the Union was already fracturing violently, with southern states actively seceding to form their own confederacy. Through 4 years of brutal, punishing warfare, he remained absolutely steadfast in his conviction that the Union must be saved. He expertly navigated immense political pressures, devastating military setbacks, and moments of profound national despair, never once wavering from this central, defining goal. His leadership, his unyielding resolve, and his remarkable ability to articulate the profound importance of maintaining the last best hope of Earth, as he famously called the American experiment, were absolutely crucial to the Union's ultimate victory. Inextricably tied to the preservation of the Union was his indispensable role in ending chattel slavery. While he approached the issue with initial political caution, prioritizing the immediate restoration of the Union, his personal views and his policies powerfully evolved throughout the war. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, though limited in its initial legal scope, fundamentally transformed the entire character of the conflict, making it a war explicitly for human liberation. It was a bold, pivotal act that fully set the stage for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified shortly after his death and formally abolished slavery throughout the entire nation. Lincoln's personal journey on the issue of slavery, from a belief in its eventual gradual extinction to becoming the undisputed great emancipator, reflected both his moral growth and his practical understanding of the war's strategic necessities. Beyond these monumental achievements, Abraham Lincoln also profoundly redefined the core meaning of American democracy and its highest ideals. In revered speeches like the Gettysburg Address, he articulated a powerful vision of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He elevated the immense sacrifices of the war by explicitly linking them to the very survival of government of the people, by the people, for the people. He imbued the struggle with a moral purpose that entirely transcended the immediate political and military objectives, giving it a universal, enduring significance. His eloquent words helped to forge a new understanding of American nationhood, one far more explicitly committed to the principles of equality and freedom for all its citizens. The far-reaching impact of Lincoln's life and leadership extended far beyond his own tragic lifetime. In the decades following his death, he rapidly became an almost mythical figure in the American collective memory, a powerful symbol of integrity, wisdom, humility, and deep compassion. His remarkable journey from a humble log cabin existence to the White House profoundly embodied the quintessentially American ideal of self-improvement and opportunity. His capacity to persevere through immense personal tragedy, including the loss of children and the immense burdens of a wartime presidency, coupled with his extraordinary capacity for empathy and forgiveness even towards his former enemies, resonated deeply and permanently with the American populace. Monuments were erected in his honor, most notably the majestic Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., which stands today as a powerful symbol of national unity and the enduring principles for which he stood. His words and actions continue to directly inspire movements for civil rights and social justice both within the United States and across the globe. His steadfast opposition to the expansion of slavery and his ultimate embrace of emancipation provided a powerful, moral precedent for future struggles against oppression and inequality everywhere. Leaders and ordinary citizens alike have drawn immense inspiration from his powerful eloquence, his unwavering moral courage, and his fundamental commitment to the ideals of liberty and justice. The enduring light of his legacy can be seen in the ongoing efforts to create a more inclusive and equitable society, one that truly lives up to the lofty promise of its founding principles. Of course, like all consequential historical figures, Abraham Lincoln was a complex man who lived in an exceptionally complex and morally gray time. Historians continue to debate various aspects of his presidency, his specific policies, and his personal beliefs. He was not without human flaws, and he made agonizingly difficult choices in wartime that sometimes drew valid criticism. Yet, the overwhelming historical consensus remains that he was a leader of extraordinary vision and character, a man who rose to meet an unprecedented national crisis with remarkable wisdom and fortitude. His capacity for personal and moral growth, his deep humanity, and his ultimate sacrifice for the nation he loved have definitively secured his place as one of the most revered figures in both American and world history. The story of Abraham Lincoln is more than simply the biography of a single president. It is a profound, illuminating reflection on the enduring struggles for freedom, equality, and national unity. His life serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest and most fractured of times, principled leadership and an unwavering commitment to higher ideals can guide a nation toward a new birth of freedom. The light he helped to ignite continues to brilliantly illuminate the path for all those who believe in the redemptive power of democracy and the inherent dignity of every human being. His legacy is not just a matter of historical record. It is a vital, living inspiration